What's up, guys? Today the plan is to keep on keeping on with westward expansion. And so last time we talked about the Transcontinental Railroad and how we kind of started to conquer the West and people crossing those rivers and those geographic challenges and getting people out west and not just information. So now what we want to talk about is what life was like for those pioneers, those people who moved out west. And so we're really going to focus on groups of people today and what they did. But the overall thing that I want you to think about is what life was like for these people as they moved out west. The first thing to know is that when people moved out west, the Great Plains, the middle of our country, got this nickname, the Great American Desert, because it was terrible farmland. Nothing grew there, just lots of short grass. There were no trees. It was really difficult to plant and grow things. And so the Great Plains were difficult when it comes to farming. And so they got this nickname, the Great American Desert. And if you're looking at this map, and I know that's a little bit off center, but we're talking about this area. This was the Great American Desert. We're going to talk more later about the people who moved out to California. But the Great American Desert was really this area right here in the middle of our country. So the first group of people that we talk about are pioneers. The word pioneer means to be the first to do something. And so everybody who moved out west, we consider them to be pioneers. So the government wanted to encourage people to move out west. And there were a couple of reasons why they wanted to encourage people to move out west. Number one, the East was getting really crowded. The cities had too many people in them, and so if people moved out west, then it kind of helped with the crowding issue. But the biggest reason is we own this land. You might remember from fourth grade when Thomas Jefferson did the Louisiana Purchase, we got a big piece of land. And so we own all this land out west. And so we want people to live there. We want people to develop it and build cities and those kind of things. And so we try to encourage our pioneers to move out west. And so if you're thinking about ways to encourage people to move out west, the first thing you want it to be easy. And so that's kind of how the Transcontinental Railroad helped, is it made it easier for people to move out west. But what the government eventually settled on to encourage people to move out west is something called the Homestead Act. And so in 1862, Abraham Lincoln passes what we call the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act essentially was a way for our government to give away the land out west. I read an article the other day and it said that 10% of our entire country was given away under this Homestead Act. So people who took advantage of the Homestead Act are called homesteaders. So we have pioneers, everybody who moves out west. People who took advantage of the Homestead Act became known as homesteaders. There were a couple of rules when it came to the Homestead Act. The first rule is you had to be a guy or the head of your house who was over the age of 21. So in other words, you had to be an adult who was in charge of your family in order to take advantage of this Homestead Act. If that was the case, then you would be given up to 160 acres of land. And that's a lot of land. A lot of land. The other rules were you had to pay this $10 filing fee. So there was a little bit of money involved, but even $10 back then was not a whole lot of money. And then you had to live on it for 5 years. And so if you were the head of your house over 21, if you paid the $10 filing fee and you lived on the land for 5 years, you would be given this 160 acres of land. And so the homesteaders were the people who took advantage of this Homestead Act. And like I said, our country gave away 10% of all of its land during this homestead kind of movement. So those were the homesteaders, the people who moved out west and took advantage of that act. The next group of people that I want to talk to you about are the Sodbusters. So we talked about it before. This area was known as the Great American Desert because not lots of things grew there. So trees didn't grow out west. Well, if you don't have trees, then you don't have wood. And if you don't have wood, it's really difficult to build things. So what they did, or what they figured out, is they could tear up the grass and they could use mud and they could build these houses out of grass and mud. So people who built their houses out of this grass became known as Sodbusters. And sod is another name for grass, so that's a good way to remember it. And so they would tear up the sod, they would tear up the grass, and they would build these houses out of grass. Now, there's lots of problems that happen when you build your house out of grass. First of all, they're not very sturdy, so these houses weren't very big. And secondly, we know things that live in grass like mice and snakes and bugs and those kinds of things. And so those were things that these people who lived in these houses had to deal with. Um, uh, were those animals and those kind of things. The best way that I've seen it put is to be a sodbuster, it was essentially like living in a hole in the ground, just above ground. So that's a good way to think about it. But you had to have a house. And so sodbusters found a way to build houses out of this grass and this mud. And sometimes they would take the wood off of their wagons and those kind of things and make doors and windows. But we're talking really small houses made out of grass. So we have pioneers, everybody who moved out west. We have homesteaders, people who took advantage of the Homestead Act. And now we have sodbusters, people who built their house out of grass. Another interesting thing that happened during this time period is we got something called America fever. And what essentially happened is there were lots of immigrants over in Europe who found out that all of these people were moving out west. And so when they found out these people were moving out west, they thought that these people were just getting tons of land and just living this awesome life. And so what happened was we had lots of immigrants who wanted to move to our country and take advantage of the Homestead Act because it was a chance for them to get land. And so lots of immigrants started to come, and they had what became known as America fever. But the cool thing is when they came with them, they brought lots of ideas with them. They brought these new kind of farming techniques. But the biggest thing they brought with them is they brought these new crops like wheat. And you might know the middle of our country today is called the breadbasket of our country. And that's because we grow all of the things that you need to make bread, wheat, there in the middle of the country. And it's interesting to think about if these immigrants hadn't heard about the Homestead Act and came over and had this America fever, they might not have ever brought wheat and those kinds of new crops. And so we might not have those today. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that happened during this time period. Another group of people that I want to talk to you about are Exodusters. So Exodusters is the name for African Americans who moved out west under the Homestead Act. If you think back to Reconstruction, African Americans in the South particularly still aren't being treated equally. They're still not being treated fairly. They're having to deal with the black codes and Jim Crow laws, and those white Southerners are still making their life really difficult. So what a lot of African Americans did is they decided, hey, life might be better out west. Benjamin Singleton was the first guy to kind of move out west, and so he urged lots of African Americans to move out west and take advantage of this chance at a brand new life. And so these African Americans, homesteaders, became known as Exodusters. They were called Exodusters because they named themselves after the book Exodus in the Bible, which, if you're familiar, is when Moses moves his people out of Egypt into the promised land. And so they considered the West to be their promised land, their chance for a brand new life. So that's another group of people. So we have pioneers, anybody who moved out west. We have homesteaders, people who took advantage of the Homestead Act. We have sodbusters, people who built their houses out of grass. We have the immigrants who came and brought things with them. And then we have Exodusters, African Americans who moved out west. And so that brings us here to the end is what was life like for these people who moved out west. And the easiest way to put it is it was very, very difficult. Very difficult. Technology was something that was necessary to survive. And when we think about technology, we think about cell phones and computers, but that's not what technology is. All technology is something that makes your life easier. And so these people who moved out west had to come up with technology or ways to make their life easier. And some of the things that they came up with is they came up with like the steel plow, which let them plow up the ground so that they could grow things. They came up with barbed wire, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this fence with barbs on it to keep other people or animals out. And so technology became essential in order to survive. Out west, it gets really, really cold during the winter times, particularly the further north you go. And so a lot of times they would have blizzards or get really cold, like at night and those kind of things. And they didn't have heat and air conditioning, so they just had to deal with the weather. Um, the Midwest gets more tornadoes than any other place on planet Earth. And so tornadoes and storms and flooding were a big problem. And you can think about if your house is made out of grass, why a tornado or a hailstorm or flooding would be really bad, really bad. So um, weather was a big problem for these people who moved out west. And you see here they had to deal with the heat during the summer. Really cold in the winter, can be really hot in the summer. Wildfires were an issue. It was really dry a lot of times, and so lightning might strike the ground and start a fire, and they had to deal with wildfires. And if you turn on the news today, you still hear about wildfires going out west, and so that was something they had to deal with. And again, if you're having to make and build your own things, a wildfire could be devastating. And then the most interesting thing is this last one. During this time when people were taking advantage of the Homestead Act, there was actually a really bad locust storm or grasshopper storm. There were so many grasshoppers in this storm that kind of flew through it. It was the size of Colorado. And so these grasshoppers came through and ate anything that was a plant that was living. And so you couldn't just go down to the grocery store and buy groceries. You had to grow your own food and grow your own plants and everything. And so for a lot of these people, when this grasshopper or this locust storm came through and ate up all their crops, it was really devastating. Again, they said there were I think they said trillions of grasshoppers, so they couldn't even see the light of day when they came through. So really difficult. So if you were a homesteader or an exoduster or one of those people a pioneer who decided to move out west, you had to deal with all of these things. And so the biggest thing to remember, again,